I authorize you to be good listeners this morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day and the opportunity that you've given to us to once again hear your word and submit to it. Lord, open our hearts and minds to hear your word, to make application of this word in our lives, and to be participants in your kingdom as a result. We ask these prayers knowing that you hear them as we lift them before you in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. I had to go back to August 13th to pull up the last time we gathered together for this Bible study on anger. And I'm pleased to be able to kind of pick up where we left off and talk about something that is part of the cause of me being gone, because one of the things that we've been working on here is at this stage in this study is the anger of God's enemies. The last time we got together, I remember going home after church that Sunday and thinking to myself, man, this was a great class. We got off track, which is my mark of a good class, is if we get off track. But what we got off track on, just to sort of catch you back into the loop of things, was a conversation on, and I believe, Bobby, you might have been the one that even brought it up, was what about unresolved anger that carries on that can't be resolved? And I thought what ensued was sort of a beautiful conversation about some of this. And it did take us a little bit afield of some of the material that we were in the midst of. So I want to first of all give you an opportunity if any questions came up, because that came right at the end of class. And one of the things that I tried to deal with you at the end of that class was to talk about what do you do when you've got unresolved anger. Maybe one of the examples I gave you was that deathbed confession of somebody. So, got a husband and a wife, for instance, and the husband's maybe, just for sake of the example, been involved in an extramarital affair during the course of his life that's never been admitted, but on his deathbed he wants to confess it and share it. And the family's gathered around and he says, I got something to tell you. And then he says this, and now the wife hears of this, and then the guy croaks. I had this affair, I've had a child, and he dies. We can kind of laugh about the example, but you have to do the what ifs a little bit when you're in seminary. And what I shared with you was, in the case of something like that, if I were present in a case like that, what I would do is I would ask the family to be excused, and I would take his confession and absolve him. And then I wouldn't share that sin or the knowledge of that sin, because that's not my job. In fact, Luther writes in the large catechism that it's my job as a pastor and under my authority as a pastor to make my ears like a grave. In other words, those words get confessed, they get absolved, the exercise of the office of the keys happens publicly, forgiveness is granted. The guy can die in peace because he's confessed his sins and received absolution. The spouse doesn't have to carry that unresolved anger with her. Think about, her whole marriage then would have been a sham if you allow her to be a partaker of that confession. And some people would say, well, that's just not fair. No, it's the way the Lord designed it, is that we can confess sins and have them absolved in such a way. But I thought it was a beautiful piece in asking about that, because I think that happens. Maybe not the example I've given you, but I think that kind of anger, unresolved, unrepentant, or unsolved can occur with us. And so where we also talked was about that process, that within us it's a process. We have a standard that gets sort of stamped on us. Well, you're God's people, so you should do like God says, which is forgive and forget. And even today in the gospel lesson, you heard, Jesus' instruction to us with regard to how do you resolve and issue a conflict with a brother in the faith. By way of reminder for those who are in the first service, and by way of a preview for those who go to the second service, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go, tell him his fault. And the hope is in that communication between you and your brother, you can resolve the conflict or the difficulty so that there need not be any anger. The second stage of that then is, if your brother fails to listen to you, tell one or two others so that your witness may be established. And if he fails to listen to you, tell it to the church. And in telling it to the church, it is to call in people who can call people to repentance, like me who's authorized to do it, for instance, publicly on behalf of the church. And so God gives us a means of absolving and resolving those anger issues. And what I've tried to encourage with people is to remember that it's a process. You are not God. So because you're not God, you may not have the ability within you to forgive somebody just because they want to be forgiven in that moment. And not to feel bad about it, but to counsel. That's sort of why we've been given, to work with people through these things, to walk them through the stages of grieving, as we talked about it on the board last time. You might be grieving this broken relationship or the brokenness that exists in the relationship. A last comment before I sort of dive into some of the texts today and take some questions is the longer I think about this, the more it strikes me when people want to justify their own anger. Because what that says is, I want to keep my anger. I want to carry that with me. And I think if you stop and back away from anger, or your own anger, or seeking to justify your anger about any particular issue, whether it be between you and someone you love, you against an entity or an organization, you against a problem or whatever, help me understand, I guess maybe that's the way I should ask that. For those that want to justify their anger, help me understand why you want to do that, why you'd want to carry that around with you. What our God does is he gives us a blessed release and an opportunity for peace, both peace within ourselves. And the way that we talked about this at the end of class last time was, I said, it's kind of like when you fail to forgive somebody. And what was the quote somebody gave me when you fail to forgive somebody? The poison you drink is wishing that they would suffer as a result of it. I'm getting that wrong. Was it? Yeah. Unforgiveness is the poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. Thank you. Patsy's the one that gave me that quote. And it's an excellent quote. Well, it's similar when it comes to anger. Why do you want to carry that around? That's the poison that you're drinking, and you're dying as a result of it because you're carrying it around, when God gives you the opportunity to release and be at peace. People want world peace. One of my favorite bumper stickers is visualize world peas. Visualize world peas. There's so many dumb things stuck up here that I don't even know where they... But we hope for peace, and God actually gives us the means to get it, which is to forgive and release. Yes, Mary Lou. Yes. Yeah. So maybe it's... Yeah, that's a brilliant observation. So what she said is, maybe it's not that I don't want to forget and I don't want to let it go. Maybe it's that my feelings have been hurt. And look at the difference. So where I say that's a brilliant observation, on one hand, it's a deliberate move on your part to hold on to the anger. That's kind of the direction I've been going. But what about when you've been victimized by your anger? That's, I think, the point that you're making, if I can put it in my terms, is, what if I've been the victim of something and I just simply can't let it go due to my inability to let it go? Is that what you're saying? Well, then what you said wasn't brilliant at all. So help me understand what you're saying then. Yeah. So maybe your feelings have been hurt and you forgive somebody. Yeah. So maybe somebody else has so, but I would still offer, no. I think I mean, I think I'm going to go back to where I was at, even if it doesn't match up to what you're saying, because I still see that as a matter of being the victim of something unwittingly, right? So maybe somebody said something untrue about you and you're hurt by that, or you were hurt in some way by that. You were victimized by what they did. Now, what I'll do with regard to that, if I can cast it that way, the reason I'm kind of wanting to go there is because I want to be able to cast it in terms of this with my answer. You guys have heard me talk about sin, where we typically talk about sins of commission and sins of omission. This is what we're so used to doing in church, right, with confession absolution at the beginning. You know, I've sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by the things that I've done and the things that I've left undone. There's your sins of commission and omission. I've committed a sin, or I've neglected to do something that God has called upon me to do, right? Those are the kinds of sins we are innately familiar with. We're so used to dealing with that kind of sin that that's just the natural step for us. The kind of sin that we rarely talk about, right, is the kind of sin that we're the victim of, where we're the unwitting recipients of the curses related to sin. And I actually sort of made allusion to this during this morning's sermon. So what do I mean by that? My example is always, if I had a time machine, if I had a DeLorean and I could go 88 miles an hour and generate 1.2 gigawatts of power, I would go back to Adam and Eve when they're just about to take a bite of that fruit of the tree, and I would go, stop! Don't do it! What you're about to do is mess it up for the rest of us. But I can't go back in time and do that because it's impossible, first of all. Well, I don't know. Some people, physicists would argue me on this point, and I'd have to forgive them. Righteous anger. But why I bring that up is what we suffer with as a result of the curses down in time is stuff that's outside of our control. So Paul writes in Romans 8, the whole creation was subjected to frustration, not of its own will, but of the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation would be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. In this hope you were saved. So God leveled curses against creation. And that answers a lot of questions for me, because now the whole creation is suffering under the weight of the burden of sin and can't get out from under it. So it's got to find a way to get out from under it. And that victimhood to sin sort of expresses itself in what I'm hearing, at least, even though that's not what you're saying, in your expression, which is sometimes we get hurt by things that are outside of our control, and even our inability to forgive somebody, or our natural tendency, which is to play protective measure against ourself, which is I'm going to justify the anger or the hurt that I have against that person because they did something to me first. Which takes us to that step of healing, as I shared it with you, is that bargaining is one of the stages in the 5 stages of grieving or reconciliation. Is that if you would just say you're sorry, then I'll forgive you. Well, no. What I'm saying is don't justify your sin, and then you're not waiting for that the bargaining chip to be exchanged in order to let go of the anger. And this is where I tell people too, what does Jesus say about life as a Christian? He says, deny yourselves daily, take up your cross, and follow me. So he doesn't say lay down on your leather couch and get fanned by your servants and eat grapes as they feed them to you, because life as a Christian is going to be easy, cheesy, peasy. He says take up your cross, which is a place of torture and death, and die to yourself daily. That's the life of the Christian. And so that's why I've always told people, and I think the brilliance of my statement is oftentimes lost on people when I say that being a Christian is simultaneously the easiest thing in the world and the hardest thing in the world at the same time. Here's why. It's the easiest thing in the world because God just tells us what to do. And isn't it easy to follow orders, to fall in line under the authority of God's word? He says, do this. But the problem is, I don't want to do that. Hey, have you guys ever seen the meme? It's there's a sheep that's fallen into this mud hole. You've seen it. I know you've seen it. The sheep is, and it says it's my life as a follower of Jesus. And the sheep has fallen in the mud hole, and this guy is down. He lifts it up out of the mud hole, and he gets it up out, and it's a deep mud hole. The sheep runs a circle and runs right back and falls in the mud hole again. My life as a follower of Jesus. That's what we do. It's the easiest thing to do. I just have to do what God tells me. Forgive as you've been forgiven. Love as you've been loved. Submit to the governing authorities, to put it in terms of today's sermon. It's easy to do. Just do it. But we don't like it, and we don't want to do it. So we go outside of it, and we circumvent it. All right, you had something too.
Well, I was looking at myself. When we started this series, I went back and I thought of all the times that I had been angry.
You can do it that way, and then I don't have to repeat it.
Oh, wow. So 90% of the time that I felt that I was really, really angry, I was the one that was carrying the anger. That person has already moved on and doesn't have a clue that I'm even angry.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of times I think that's what we harbor that and we think, I'm going to get even. And they're like, for what? You know, they have no idea
because they've let it go.
Yeah, they've let it go. So again, you're hurting yourself. You're taking yourself down into a deep hole that you're never going to get out of. And that person has, moved on to other things.
You know, that's also, that's building, I think, on sort of what you brought up the last time we were together that I'm talking about now. And what I would offer with regard to that is there's help for people like you.
I don't think so.
At seminary, I took, I won't go into all the reasons why we had to do this, but I had to attend group therapy, which everybody goes, whoa! But so you take counseling classes because that's part of the degree requirement for us, but they also had a guy that would do individual review with us to make sure that we are capable of being in the ministry. Somehow I made it through. But anyway, in the course of meeting with him, he gives you, like he finds deficiencies. They meet with your vicarage coordinator and things like that, and they look for character deficiencies with you, and then they look to try and answer some of those. So if I'm really bad at, with my time, then I might have to take a time management class. If I've got terrible hygiene, I might have to take, literally, they do this with seminary students. They didn't have to do it with me, hygiene classes. But I had other things they had to work on, so they had me meet with group therapy, and in the beginning I didn't understand why they had me do this, although I had good communication with Dr. Shopper who had me do it, and I was so thankful that I got to do it, because group therapy gave me an avenue that I'd never understood before, because I was always of the opinion that therapy was meant for people who are broken. And what I learned after being a part of it and participating in it was actually therapy like that is for people who are really working on something in their life. And it's literally work. At the end of each of our group therapy sessions, the guy that was leading it, Reverend Dr. Joel Hempel, would say, good work, fellas. You're doing good work here. And it's work. Because sometimes it's work to bring those feelings back out. And that's where I make light of it a little bit. There's help for you. And I'm not saying, you're a candidate for therapy. Sure. Maybe you are. But in reality, maybe all of us are. Because the God that we know in the scriptures has created us to be in community. Okay? And if he's built us to be connected to one another, it even talks in the gospel today, when there's one lost sheep, what happens? The shepherd goes and looks for that lost sheep that fell into the mud hole and fetches it back out. Why? To bring it back in community. Because when you're in an individual situation, you're easy prey for Satan. When you're bound together and there's mutual accountability and there's love and care and concern for one's neighbor, now you're in a protective body of Christ. Right? So while I, on one hand in this morning's sermon, celebrated the idea that we've been forced to come up with new ways of delivering the church to people in a time of pandemic, I'll also lament them at the same time, right? And I lament them because what it did in some cases, while it connected some people to a body that they would have not otherwise been connected to, in other cases, it divided them from the body because they said, well, now I don't have to go to church. Woohoo, I can just tune in on YouTube anytime it's convenient for me. And that's not exactly what the Lord had in store. He called us together to be a body and support one another. And that's sort of what therapy can do for us, is if you've got these sort of unresolved things, yeah, maybe they did move on without it. And maybe what you're realizing about yourself is, I have been carrying this and I need to find a way to let it go. And therapy is a brilliant place to take it and unload it.
What I did was I just looked at myself and said, what's the point?
Yeah.
If I'm the only one,
Yeah.
and I'm 90% of it right there, and they're the 10% that has moved away.
Yeah, and isn't it a much more peaceful feeling?
I sleep with it.
Yeah, I get a peaceful, easy feeling, and I know it won't let me down. The Eagles. All right, any other questions, thoughts? Yes, Marilyn. Oh, do we want to take this behind closed doors? Oh. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Marilyn, what she's sharing for those that can't hear and those that are listening online is that she had a similar issue with someone that she became divided with, and it happened to be over maybe some misunderstanding. And this is where I said, where I gave credit where it wasn't due to Mary Lou, that's why I really want to go there, because that was something that I had not considered, but I do think there's a lot of value in that victimhood of it's really a result of the fall and sin, where there are misunderstandings that lead to division that becomes unresolved. And sometimes you end up being the unwitting victim of something like that. And we have to be able to resolve that, which, by the way, I never really finished some of that thought, but if you think about, there are two different paradigms of talking about sin. One is when you are personally responsible, so sins of omission and commission. The other is sins where you're the victim of sin, for instance, original sin, and the sort of the effect that has of God's curse against creation. Well, if we can talk about sin in two ways, the good news is, because we're law gospel people, sin, that we're aware of on account of the law, well, now we got to be able to talk about the gospel. And the beauty of it is that the scriptures offer two different ways of addressing sin with the gospel that attack both ways. So if you're talking about sins that you're personally responsible for, sins of omission and sins of commission, you need to have somebody that pays the price for your responsibility for those sins. So the scriptures speak of Jesus, we call it in terms of Christus Vicar. So that's Latin for Christ vicarious. He is the vicarious substitutionary atonement for you who have caused this sin by your action or inaction. So when you're talking about sin in that paradigm, you have to talk about Christ as your substitutionary atonement. He bore in his body the marks of your sin, and so that's what we call Christus Vicar, or the vicarious atonement of Christ. Go to the other paradigm, which we rarely talk about, which is when you're the victim of sin, unwittingly. And that's what I've been kind of harping on and building a little theological case for. Guess what? The beauty of the scriptures and the gospel presented in them speaks of Jesus in such a way on that end, we call it Christus Victor. That's how Jesus gets preached with regard to that. And that is Christ victorious. So you think of like Jesus, riding in on his white horse to save the day, resurrected from the dead, because now not even the power of death can hold him. He burst forth from the tomb, victorious over sin, death, and the devil. And he's not the victim of anything. He's the powerful Christ victor. You see the difference between the two paradigms? And we get different views of Jesus in scriptures both ways. Right? Jesus isn't just the weak little lamb of God who, suffers and dies on a cross. He's not just the Good Friday Jesus who's the suffering vicarious substitution. He's the victorious Transfiguration Sunday, Easter Sunday, power over the wind and the waves Jesus. You with me? We can talk about him both ways. And that's the beauty of what I get to do is, let's say you come to me to do therapy. Because that's Monday. 9 o'clock on Monday, I'll see you. There's help for people like you. Let's say you come to me for therapy. My job, I tell people, I'm not a counselor. Like what I learned in my counseling classes is I learned enough to not mess with that stuff because that's not my specialty discipline. Some pastors will pursue an MA, a Master of Arts in family counseling and therapy, and more power to those guys. What I learned was I know enough to be dangerous to help root out the cause of things. And I tell people I'm not a licensed mental health practitioner. Likely what I'll do is if we visit with one another, I'll help you assess your needs and I'll try and get you in touch with somebody who can do counseling with you. What I am is a theological counselor because I'm trained in the theology. And, so years ago, many of you know this, that I had applied to med school and wanted to be a doctor and sort of trying to avoid seminary was the idea. And then God got me there anyway, which was kind of funny. But I always joke that like doctors sort of amaze me because you go to a doctor and you go, Doc, my pinky finger hurts. I've got a bruise on my left rear end cheek and my big toe feels like it aches once in a while if I stand on it the wrong way. What's wrong with me? And the doctor goes to his medical journals and he looks things up and he goes, well, these symptoms, well, that means that you've got blah, blah, blah. And a doctor has to come up with a diagnosis of whatever your presenting symptoms are and what they sort of, precipitate out to. And I often marvel at doctors who have that art and that skill of being a diagnostician because that's not in my bailiwick. We pastors, and I'm speaking collectively, are dumber than that. And when people come into our office, they come with all kinds of presenting symptoms. Pastor, my marriage is on the rocks. Pastor, my life is a mess. Pastor, my finances are bad. Pastor, I can't forgive somebody. Pastor, I've got this unresolved or unrepented sin. They come with all manner of stuff. And our job as pastors, because we're not that smart, is to get people to see that there's really only one diagnosis to all the problems that they present with. And what's the diagnosis? You guys know it. Sin. Because if you can get them to see that sin is the diagnosis, then you get to give them the prescription, which is Jesus. You see? Bingo. You guys got the good Sunday school answer, Jesus. Well done. So I think that's important for us to kind of bear in mind that you know what you're going to get with me. And the problem for sometimes people is that they just don't want to see that sin is at the root of it. And that's where the tools of being able to call sin as something that you're either personally responsible for or something that you're the victim to is helpful, and why I've been able to sort of employ that in those moments. So, we good? Yeah, Ron.
I just want to make comment that it seems to me sometimes when you're talking about unresolved anger, it's because somebody, like what I'm hearing, somebody's hurt you for some reason, or you're right. I mean, I'm positive I'm right, and they just argue against you. And I think part of the issue is, so what if I'm right? Do you want to make that the issue of your life and hang on to that, or do you want to just say, I remember my grandmother used to say stuff when I was partly raised me as a little kid, and she would say something like, God will take care of this when something happens. And I never realized the wisdom in that. She would just, something bad would happen, God will handle that person, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so I think, as human beings, we have a hard time, I can speak for myself, when I'm right, it's hard to say, you know what, I'm right and you're wrong. But you have, in my case, you have to learn to say, but so what?
Yeah. Two things that I'd say to that. The first is the text from, I think, was it last week or several weeks ago? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. That was from Romans. Paul quotes it. So that's what your grandma was saying. So there's a lot of wisdom in that. The second thing that I'll say with regard to that is Luther. As Luther wrote about the doctrine of justification, it's Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession and the Apology, Article 4. And it is some of the most beautiful reading. In fact, he says Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession is the article in our confession upon which the church, with a capital C, stands or falls. Either we're believers in the doctrine of justification, that Christ died for the ungodly, right? Or we believe that we are having to do self-justification for ourselves and earn in some way, shape, or form our salvation before God. Well, Luther goes further on this doctrine of justification. He says literally, well, actually Dr. Gerhard Forde does this in a book, where all life is about justification. And what the point Dr. Forde makes is that literally every decision that every person makes all the time is one of trying to self-justify. I'm trying to justify my own actions. And that's what I'm hearing you say. Well, I'm right. Doesn't matter. I'm right. I'm going to hold on to my anger. I don't want to listen to authorities. And it's always us trying to justify ourselves, when in reality, our God has justified us. So you get one or the other, you don't get both. Hear me loud and clear on this. You either justify yourself or you're justified by Christ. And there is no middle ground. And there's freedom in being justified by Christ. There is never freedom when you're having to justify yourself, because you're constantly having to give defense. You see? Jim. Did you go to another church?
I watch TV. I don't turn it off. But anyway, he gave a what's it to you service. And he said, we all are unhappy because we worry about every problem that exists worldwide and nationally and all these things. And he said, God would tell us, if we complain about most of these problems, he'd say, what's it to you? Because you didn't cause it, and you can't do anything about it. Why are you paying any attention to it? Turn it over to me. I thought that was a good point. I don't agree with it entirely, but
I think what you're saying is sort of a summary statement as to why I wanted to have this study in the first place. Is, as I've observed, I think people carry along a lot of unresolved anger. And over lots of things, because of the term that I use with you guys is recreational outrage. Like we're happier when we're angry about something. And my goal is to try and get you to go, look, there's a better way. Our God gives us a better way. And I think that's sort of the what's it to you thing that you're mentioning here.
who was Ron's Church of Christ?
Oh. Let's move into the slides here. Let's come back to this church. We're looking at examples from Scripture, and we may not make it beyond one here, which is why I'm sort of on this one. And I'll tell you why. Because what had me gone was we were traveling in a trip in the footsteps of Paul, and this particular text, and I'm going to catch up to speed why this is an issue here. This particular text played a significant role in the trip. Excuse me. We're looking at this part, how we're looking at the anger in the New Testament of God's enemies. That, remember, the author of the study, Dr. Gibbs, when he was doing this work, was looking at just a survey of anger in the Scripture, basic survey of anger in the Scriptures, okay? And in that basic survey, he categorized the kinds of anger that he saw, and the section that we're working in right now is when he found anger present in the New Testament. One of the places where he found it was in the enemies of Christ, or the enemies of God. okay, or the messengers of God. So what I was in the middle of doing with you guys is giving you examples from Scripture where the enemies of God are expressing their anger. You with me? So in Acts chapter 19, I'm going to read this to you, and then we'll see how we handle this going forward. But where I was, one of the places that I went on our travels was to ancient Ephesus in Kuştaşay, Turkey. And we went literally to the place where this text was written about. So I'm going to share with you a couple of pictures from this place. And it was very poignant to me, and I think also an appropriate re-entry point to this study. Okay? So Acts 19. You got to remember where we're at in the book of Acts. Saul is now Paul, and Paul is preaching the way. Okay, so and what's his MO when he goes in to preach the way wherever he goes? He first goes to the synagogue, and he finds Jews because they're going to be familiar with the Old Testament texts, and he's going to reason with them with the Old Testament texts. And if he can't get the Jews to listen, then who does he go to? The Gentiles. Thanks be to God, because I'm looking around the room at a bunch of Gentiles, okay? And I'm included in there. And that's sort of what's going on, is he's been to the temple in ancient Ephesus, and he's been reasoning with people. So about that time, we're going to pick up here in Acts 19. There arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged. So there's your anger. They were crying out, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! So the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him, and even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out, in anger, I would add, with one voice, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Okay, so you see the anger of these people vilifying Paul and his companions who are there to proclaim Jesus. Now, I want to share this. I sort of added some of this for you guys. The first is this right here. This is a statue of Artemis of the Ephesians. Okay? This particular picture I took in the Vatican Museum. So this is I took this one in Ephesus, but there's one just like it in the Vatican Museum that Christians have taken from the site of Ephesus, and it's been transferred to Rome, and it's in the hallways as you work in your way to the Sistine Chapel. But it is exactly like this. So this is Artemis of the Ephesians. Yeah, I was about to. So when people look at this, if you look sort of up close, it's hard to see maybe on the screens here, but you see these sort of things up front here. They may remind you of mammary glands, but that's not what they are. They're actually testicles. Because Artemis of the Ephesians was a goddess, and her temple was located in Ephesus, and she was worshipped as a fertility god. So if you think to some of the biblical knowledge that you guys have, what's one of the worst things that can happen to a woman or a husband and wife is that she would be barren and they would be unable to have children. So they would go to these different temples of all these different gods to offer worship, and their form of worship was likely sleeping with, having sexual relations with a temple prostitute, so that it would excite the gods and get the gods, the particular gods, willing to grant them whatever it was that they wanted. So what you see here, and then down below what you see is lions' heads, goat heads, sheep heads, lionesses, bulls, and different animals that they all worshipped, along with, remnants of the body. You see bulls kind of up along here, but this is Artemis of the Ephesians. Now on the other side of this slide, yes?
What's the size of that? How tall is that?
That one right there was about yay tall off the ground, but the one at the Vatican Museum would have been about my height, so about 6 foot tall. This is the main drag at ancient Ephesus that I took a picture of, and what you see here is people kind of walking down the walkway, and I kind of threw these pictures together quickly. This here is what they call, as you walk down that main pathway, this is the remnants of a building called the Library of Celsus. And so we're standing in front of the Library of Celsus, and if you go immediately to the right, behind the wall over here, is a large open field where they had what they called the agora. And the agora would have been like the mall, the shopping mall of its day. And next to the agora was where this ginormous temple of Artemis of the Ephesians would have been located. Okay? So you got to kind of envision a little bit. I can pull more pictures if you want. This walkway. And I tried to stick this video in here. So this is my former professor that was on the trip with us. And we're standing on the edge of the agora, and what you see here is the remnants of the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians. Okay? And what you can't see is where he's facing, and because I didn't put all this together, didn't have time to get enough stuff together on this, I had to pick up and find out where we were, and I realized we're right in this great spot where I can show you literally where this actually happened, and I just threw a couple of pictures together, but if you bear with me, maybe I can fix some of this. But he literally read, as he's standing right there, and I had the video of him reading from Acts chapter 19, this text, so that we would sort of have the significance of the location in this moment right where it happened. Okay? So if you carry on, what you see right here is two suspect-looking dudes here in the actual theater that people were drug into, that Paul was told not to go into. And they have signs before you enter into the theater that say, please, no noise in here, because I'm sure people walked into the theater going, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" But that is the literal theater into which you hear this story and the anger of people. And they said this theater could hold, what was it, 25,000, roughly?
You read the sign, I didn't. I said it.
It wasn't 250,000. You're wrong.
No, I'm not. I'm going to research.
I'll see if I can pull up a little more to just sort of help you at the risk of, there, we're going to do this real quick so I can get back to where these pictures are. But just to walk you through a little bit of this, Turkey, so modern day Turkey is where this was at. We went through ancient Ephesus and sort of walked. They park you at one end of it and drop you off at a bus, and then you walk through all the city streets of ancient Ephesus. So I'll just pick up here. So this is sort of right by the entrance where they drop you off. And some ruins that are up above here. So this is part of the city, and you can see some of the city streets. And when you see like these caves, these would have been both houses as well as shops. Some of what they've excavated, they estimate they've only excavated about 20% of this whole site. And maybe I'll do this also with you real quick here. I knew this was going to happen when I just started digging into this. But if we go to maps, just give you an idea of where things are at and where we were at with all this. Here's where we are right now. See how quickly this comes up. So if we go out of the United States and we go to Macedonia, so you see that it's still called Macedonia, right in the center of the screen right there, North Macedonia. This is the country of Greece and the Aegean Islands. And then if you look right down here, this is, and I'll kind of make this a little larger so you can see it. The port that we stopped at was Kushtashay right here. And we had to take a drive back in through the hills or around the hills. And you see the sea, sort of the Aegean Sea stops right here. But there's a riverbed that flows through here, and this is all silted in since Ephesus was a major port city. Okay, so basically, if you sort of look here, here's sort of the ancient world. This is the Mediterranean, right? So here's Jerusalem over here, and Paul would have traveled up through Asia and come through this way on his way through here towards Rome. Okay, so he traveled up this way, and here's Kushtashay in Turkey. And then we're going to zoom in on that, because what you see right here as you look at even a map is you see all this, how it's sort of lighter green. The reason it's lighter green is because that was a river basin that has silted in. So ancient Ephesus would have existed. We actually traveled around through here and then came out onto this plain, and ancient Ephesus existed where they would have had vision or a view towards the sea. So now let's take a look back at the. Yeah, it was like, you remember it? Yeah, like 20 to 30 feet it had built up. Same thing was true in ancient Corinth, where some of this stuff had built up. So you see some of the buildings there. This is part of the open agora. This was interesting. These are just clay tiles that were used to pipe water, just like the kind that we still use today. They piped water and sewage. So they had modern, amenities like we have. So there you see like those pipes laying in a field, where this would have been an upper level of the agora. So you come in, you walk down a street that goes this way, you find that temple or the Library of Celsus, you take a right and you go past the Temple of Artemis, and then you end up at the theater. So there's a whole bunch of them stacked up that they've recovered. And something that was, so this is not that theater. Actually, this is a smaller theater that was up high. So they had multiple places where people would go and reason with one another. And so this is sort of up at the top of the area that's been excavated. I'm going to move through these quickly because I took a lot of pictures.
Really?
I know, imagine that. So there you get a kind of a view towards that main drag and Amy. But if you look, you see this street that sort of moves its way down, and there's that Library of Celsus. If you go around the corner of this mountain, that's where the theater is. And all this flat plain out here is all where the river is silted in. So you're about 8 miles inland when you get here. There's another suspect dude. There you see, this is the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians. So look what's right there on the sign, and see how they've even shown it laying in that sign where they found it buried after it had fallen off of its pedestal. Yeah, these roads, I took pictures of the roads. Every time a city would get conquered, they would steal resources from that city, take them to new places, and use the materials recycling to build new cities. So these roads that you see right here, are likely roads that Paul would have walked on because they've excavated down to these, but it's just slabs of marble. And it's slick, hard to walk on, uneven. But I wanted to get some pictures of it anyway. So you see all over the place, you'll see like these reliefs of things where they've found or recovered some of them and they've tried to put them back to the way they understood that they fit in. This right here is, oh, there's cats there. I don't know if you can see this, but what this is the medical arts. So you see like that the staff with the serpent on it, and it's reminiscent of Moses. You know, when the people were being bit by the asps, he was made to put a gold or a bronze serpent on a staff, and they had a record of it here. So that's where they pulled aside and showed us that. That's our gal that was our kind of guide while we were there. I'll back up and I want to show you just sort of down by, maybe I can have him do this. So we went through an entire housing complex, and if you want to think of like downtown Manhattan, these were floors, mosaic floors in the houses that they have excavated. These big homes, you know, that the artwork, we walked through a big building that there's looking back at all the homes, and it's basically like apartment complexes, or I would say really nice condos. Because Ephesus was a major port city and would have been like, I mean, to be in this housing complex where all these things have been excavated would have been like living in downtown Manhattan. So when you think about Paul in Ephesus reasoning with people, there's going to be mass crushes of crowds. So this anger that these people had when they rushed him towards the theater and took him in this way, that's still in front of the library at Kelsis. And then that's people coming down that big walkway right there. And then if you go to this direction, your right, then you would walk down a pathway. Sorry, I got to skip over some of these here. Let's see if I can play this now. 25,000. Yes! Justified. Oh. So there you see the theater from where we're standing. So we're standing in an area that was the Agora and where the Temple of Artemis was. And then there's a walkway that takes them down to the theater. So probably 600 yards tops.
Let me just read the passage for a couple of minutes. So this is Acts 19, starting verse 21. After these events, Paul resolved in the spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also to Rome. And having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So yesterday was Macedonia, Thessalonica, and Philippi. Today we're in Asia. But he wants to go to Rome, but then about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. The way is the word from back to the church. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, made silver shrines of Artemis.
So we're standing in the Agora where he would have been selling these shrines.
Similar traits, he said, well, and you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not God. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. So when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the city was filled with confusion. They just imagine the streets, right? The city is filled with confusion. They rushed together into the theater over there, dragging him to the theater. So they rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians were Paul's companions and travelers. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, so Asiarchs are the appointed officials, rulers for the region, even some of the Asiarchs who were friends of Paul, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make defense to the crowd or explanation of the word. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So for 2 hours, there you get the chance. Not a lot of entertainment that day, right? So when the town clerk, that's the grammateus, the town clerk, had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred, the great Artemis who fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash, for you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess." And all Paul is saying, one God. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we are really in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. So it's an interesting move by Paul's friends, because the worst thing for Romans was crowds and riots. They kind of do what you want, don't get a massive crowd together. And if you did that, if you gathered together and decided to riot, that's when the Romans got angry. Kind of typical. So when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. And Paul got off the hook, and then he continued his travel. So it all unfolds kind of all right here. And if you want to go for 2 hours in the theater and start changing,
I'll do it for 15 seconds.
I can't say that it's a
Yeah, you really can't do it at all because, like I said, they sort of quiet you from doing any of that. But there's sort of a large view of it. That was a good picture, Amy. And then we did a group picture kind of down in the middle of all of it too, where you could look out. But as you come out of there, I am sort of in the middle of the whole thing. What's that? In all my glory. And the last thing I'll show you is sort of, if I can find it here. If you look out from, maybe I didn't get a picture of it. Thought I did. If you look out from the steps of the entrance into the theater, you sort of see yet another entire walkway that's just filled with columns that the city just goes on. But it was, I mean, this was the center of it all, and it's a massive, sprawling area. And like I said, it's about only 20% excavated at this point, so they haven't even discovered. One thing I will show you right at the end here that I thought was interesting was they were actually doing excavation while we were there. And that was sort of interesting to see. No, it would have been open. So if you look right here, these guys, we're walking along and these guys are all doing active excavation of the site right there in front of us. So you see them putting boards up to support this wall. And the crowd was gathered here because not only were we walking down the street, but if you see this stone right here, this stone is a stele. That's it right there. That is Athena Nike, who was another one of the gods of the day. But what's sort of interesting, I'll just pinch the screen there to make it bigger. What's interesting to me is if you see this right here, whenever she's depicted, that's her flowing skirt. That's where Nike shoes gets their swoosh from. So that's the goddess Athena Nike, and they literally took inspiration from because she's depicted this way every time, they took inspiration from the carvings of her for their swoosh on their shoes. Isn't that crazy?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. All right, you learned something new today. I wish it was something better than that, but I better call it a day at this. But great stuff, and hopefully we'll have other opportunities to share. Have a blessed day and week in the Lord, folks.